Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me today. We have, again, a special guest. Nigel Calder is joining us today because we're going to be talking all things solar. Based on our last podcast that we did with Nigel on various topics, we've had a great feedback, and I don't know, we're sort of excited to expand on what's going on with solar panels in the marine market. And we're going to be talking about controllers, we're going to talk about quality, how do you size an array? We're going to be visiting all that. And Nigel is going to be sharing a lot of his information that he has. I have to say, every time I get a chance to speak with Nigel, it's a learning experience for all of us. If you haven't checked out his books, by the way, please do. They're considered Bibles in the industry, and that's not my wording. That's the wording from the peer groups out there. Also, last time we did this podcast, we also introduced Nigel's boat how-to. There's going to be links below. Check that out. If you want to educate yourself, and remember, this is a journey, right? Nigel's still doing it. I'm just started the journey. I've been doing this for 15 years as a boat owner, and I'm still learning every day. Every day we're learning. So the best way is obviously forums, the internet, books. There's all these different resources. It's all a journey. You never get to the end, and it's about just having a better experience on our boat. So today we're going to be focusing on solar panels on boats and controllers, and our guest speaker is Nigel. As you can tell from my smile, it's 100% genuine and always a pleasure. Nigel, thanks for joining us here today.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. And
awesome.
We actually have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we do.
There's been a raft of new technologies coming into the solar world in the last few years, and some of them as recently as last year, which have basically changed many of the prescriptions we've used for recommending solar panels on boats. So it's a really good time to be talking solar.
Yeah, and it's I always tell this. There's some of us do solar for the right reasons in terms of being green, not oil and stuff. That's some of us, but in terms of just tangible benefits as a boater, we're talking here in British Columbia and Northwest. About half of our boaters are power boaters, and they even have generators on board, and it's very real. Like, you can actually do quite a lot with solar. Not maybe everything you hope for. All of us always have a little bit more power needs than what's available, but you can make a substantive difference in terms of your recharging of batteries with the sun. It's not a gimmick. It's not just a feel-good purchase, and it makes a big difference. Yeah. So thanks for joining me here today.
Well, thank you. And actually, somebody I want to introduce you to, Jeff, is Tom Whitehead, who's an expert on the controller side of solar panels. And actually, he just wrote an article in the latest edition of Professional Boat Builder magazine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is well worth anybody that wants to get a head around solar controllers. That's the best article, best information around at the moment on solar controllers. Awesome. So let me get out of the way, and I'm going to put Tom in here.
All right, let's do it. Let's have Tom chime in. Hey, Tom.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about solar controllers. So we had a few talking points a little bit, and maybe I'm going to ask you some questions, steer a little bit of the conversation. Of course, the podcast, it's not, doesn't have to be too sort of regimented in terms of our approach. Let's talk about a little bit about one of the questions I get a lot asked from YouTubers and fellow boaters is, Jeff, what about PWM versus MPPT? And by the way, I should have actually go before that. Let me just pause, put context to everyone. A controller is an essential part of a solar array for everyone that's wondering. You really can't do without one. The sun might be shining that day a lot and your batteries are full and your batteries don't need more power. And so the job of the controller is to really have a brain and decide what should it do with the solar energy that it is able to utilize, right? Ultimately, it's making decisions. What should it do with the energy? Should it charge at 13 volts, 14 volts on a 12-volt battery bank? It's constantly looking at the voltage, making decisions so that your batteries are charged as fast as possible, but also not overcharged. And yes, I have seen people connect solar panels directly to batteries, and it does happen. Obviously, we all make mistakes, and that's normal. But yeah, some solar panels are 20 volts, 22 volts, 24 volts. Some panels are only 7 or 8 volts. Some panels are 35 volts. So all those voltages need to be modified and adapted so that the batteries get what they want. And so here with Tom, what we're going to be talking about next is how do you go about choosing a solar controller for your boat? So back to my question, I guess, Tom, is this dilemma that people have with PWM versus MPPT controllers. Do you want to weigh in on that a little bit and give the listeners a sense of that choice?
Absolutely. I actually wanted to touch base on what you were just previously saying about whether they need a controller at all, because I actually get that inquiry sometimes. People say, well, I need a 12-volt panel for my 12-volt batteries. And actually a fair number of installers even who are new to solar have no clue that a lot of panels are less than 12 volts too. So as far as PWM, I'm not a total expert on it, but my understanding is that stands for pulse width modulation.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
It's an earlier technology that can be efficient under certain circumstances. Essentially, because all of our charge regulators use target voltages, right? And so to hold the battery at its target voltage, once it gets there, it interrupts and does a pulse to hold it there. Yeah. And the newer MPPT controllers actually convert the DC current to AC and then back to DC again. And during that conversion process, they're able to maximize what they call the power point tracking. So it's where are we being most efficient? Where is the maximum current happening? And then through the magic of electronics, it optimizes that. So in general, like here at Ocean Planet, we don't sell any PWM controllers.
Same. Never sold one.
Now in certain, I think land-based installations, it can be a much more affordable way to do it. But I mean, the MPPT controllers are coming down in price as well. So I don't see it as even a question. We only sell the MPPT, especially on boats where there's so much shading and so many possibilities that, you know, things are going to be inefficient anyway, that we only sell the MPPT.
Yeah, and you bring a good point, Tom. I same here. We've never sold a PWM. Again, it depends, I think, on the price of your solar array, right? So if you're going with a rigid panel and you're getting away with $100 panel, it's going to be harder to spend $150 on a controller. It's hard to justify. The controller is more than the panel. But if you're going with flexible solar panels or high-end solar panels, and now your panel is, could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Some panels are thousands of dollars, depending on the make and the model. Then the controller is a smaller, percentage-wise, is a smaller fraction of the overall array. And you're right. I think on land, it's definitely being used for boaters out there that are using really inexpensive, obviously, very budget-conscious, rigid solar panels. Then, yeah, maybe PWM might make sense for you because, honestly, we can't judge. Some of us can't afford what we want. We do what we can. But if you are spending quite a lot of money on good, flexible, or even good rigid panels, you're going a long way. Then I always tell people, I'm not telling you what to do, but I strongly encourage you to look at NPPT. And the efficiency difference is huge. I think it's almost, you gain it's over 20%. I think difference in efficiency.
It can actually be as high as 30%.
Wow.
So I would even use that as a sales pitch to someone with that big glass panel. It's like, hey, you want to get 30% more power out of the panel that you already have? Switch to this controller.
We do that a lot. To be honest, there's a lot of boat builders who are still doing PWM, budget boat builders. It happens. And we tell people, you might have a 200 watt array on there, but you're only having right now, you're all over PWM. And you're right, Tom, that's a good point. Some of us as boaters have an array already. And if you want to just do more out of that array than you have, swapping the controller might be one way to instantly overnight maximize, get the rated output that you had hoped from that array from the get-go without actually doing anything else, not changing the solar panel, not changing the wiring, just simply swapping out the controller from a PWM to an MPPT. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, well, So if I'm going to walk a customer through picking a controller,
Yeah, tell us.
you basically start with real estate to pick out what panels you're going to use. Because on boats, the real estate is prime. It's hard to find where you're going to put the panels. So that's your first thing. And then once you end up with what panels you have, the next important consideration is the shading. So how are these panels going to be shaded? Is the boom on top of them? Is it not? Et cetera, et cetera. So our first thing that we usually recommend is one controller per panel for optimal efficiency. And then if there isn't a big concern about shading, let's say a typical thing is like up on the flybridge of a powerboat. People are now asking me for more solar to keep their refrigeration running while they're sitting on the mooring. Up there where there's no shading, I'll recommend putting the panels in series, right? Which will then dictate the size of controller that you use. To me, that's the next best option. If there is shading, some people recommend going to putting the panels in parallel as opposed to series, which will then change, the resulting current and voltage that's going to the controller. So that will also dictate the controller.
Yeah, and you bring a good point here. There is no, and I get this all the time. I mean, I'm talking every day. I'm talking like 10 times a day. People are like hopeful. They're asking these leading questions, and they say, "Oh,
Yeah.
can I'll just get one control for all my panels." What they're trying to do is, I know we're all doing the same thing. We're trying to save money, right? Boating is an expensive hobby for all of us, regardless of our income. We're always stretching ourselves to have the best boat we can afford. So it's hard for all of us. Even some of my clients that have a lot of money, it's still a huge expense for them because proportionally they're spending a lot of money on their boat. So we all feel the same way. And what I see is they were saying, "Oh, maybe I can get away with one control for all my panels." I'm like, "Yeah, you might. Let's say you could." But remember, that controller is sized for various factors, and you brought those variables. Like one would be, what is going to be the maximum input voltage of the panel. The other is what's going to be the maximum amperage coming in or through that controller, either from the panel to the controller, from the controller to the battery. What's the max amperage? What's the max wattage of that array? What's the and also, can you configure that controller for charging, let's say, for example, a Firefly battery or an AGM or a gel battery bank, right? Can you customize the charge profile to fit the battery you have? And then also, one error I did, and I forgot, I remember this a few years ago, didn't ask the owner if he had a 12 volt or 24 volt system. You also have to decide.
Yeah.
If you've got a 24 volt system, you've got to make sure that you get a controller. Not all controllers are able to connect to 12 and 24. Sometimes you have to buy the right controller for the voltage of your battery bank. So tons of choice.
We've been selling more solar systems for electric propulsion support as well. And there you're getting into 36 volt, 48 volt.
Right.
And again, that's a really good point. What is the voltage of the system you're dealing with? The other big hurdle or the big decision that you need to make is whether you need, on the one hand, a buck controller, what they call a buck controller, which brings like your 20 volt panel down to 14 volts. Or if you need, on the other hand, a boost controller, because a lot of the mono cell panels that we sell nowadays are under 12 volts. They're only putting out, say, 9 volts or even 12 volts, which isn't enough, right? Because we're charging to 14. So that's another really important distinction. And often if you have, let's say, 3 medium to small panels and you want each panel to have its own controller, then it has to be a boost controller.
Yeah.
And currently there's really only one really good boost controller on the market, which is made by the Jennison Corporation. I think we have.
Yeah.
This is not a boost controller, but you can.
It looks like that.
The size of it. Yeah. It's about the size of an old chalkboard eraser to those of us who remember what a chalkboard eraser is. Anyway, and the only other boost controller that we've sold is by the Western company from Italy. And the differences between those two are essentially this one does temperature compensation by being in the same space as the battery, right? So it senses the ambient temperature around the battery. So this has to be in the battery space or like in a similar locker next to the battery. So it's about the same temperature. The Western boost controller actually runs a wire to the battery. And so you have a little more choice about where to mount it. Western also makes a really unique controller, the WM10, which does either buck or boost. So if you have a panel system that's fluctuating between being a little bit under 12 and then over, like if you have two panels, you hook up the WM10 and it'll do both. So that's a pretty cool option. But like we've been hounding Victron for a year or so. Like, you guys need to come out with a boost controller, and
Yeah, it's so true. On my boat, when I did my solar array about 8-9 years ago, I had 3 panels that were 50-watt, Solbian 50 watts, SP 50s. And all of them were connected to exactly 2 boost controllers. And I think it's essential. You brought that point up, and even all of us get sort of maybe not, hurdles, I guess surprising things, and it's often that people come back and say, I have a 12-volt battery, I want a 12-volt panel. That assumption. And I remind, and it's really important to remember that it's not that the panel is not worse because it has a lower voltage, and it's not better because it has a higher voltage. At the end of the day, there's no way that your panel will ever output what the battery needs over time, adapting as the battery gets discharged or charged. And so you have to have a controller. And the question is, are you going to get a boost because the panel voltage is lower than what you need? Or are you going to get a buck, which means you're going to bring it down? Or that Western. And by the way, we've had success with that Western Marine as well. We use it sometimes, and it does make sense. It's a little bit bigger controller, not as compact.
It also has a little readout screen on it, and some people love that.
Yeah,
they can just look right at it, and they don't have to remember what the flashing lights mean. That it's reading, so many watts are happening. That's another nice thing about them.
So do you want to talk a little bit? It sounds like you're pretty familiar. Can you talk a little bit about I get questions about those lights on those Jennison controllers a lot. Do you want to talk a little bit about, can you talk a little bit about those status lights on the controllers, by the way? Do you get a lot of questions about that?
I'm not a person who keeps data in my head very well. So usually when a customer calls me, I go and I open the manual and double check. But essentially, like on these Jennisons, there's this little LED light here, and it will flash at different rates. So if it's flashing really quickly, that means it's charging, but at kind of a low amperage, below where it's supposed to be. So it's not really doing its full thing. If it charges at a more regular, like 1 second interval, if it flashes, then it's charging at the bulk absorption setting. If it's solid green, that means the battery's charged and it's done. Then there are a myriad of red lights and that flash at different rates to tell you different things are bad. And then there's another one that tells you that the fuse inside the unit is blown. So it's actually quite useful, the LED.
I agree.
And Jennison's pretty good about laying that out in the manual.
Yeah, reading the manual always. So many of us don't read the manual often enough, or we read it and we put it away and we forget. The other thing too, it's worth noting. I get this all the time. People expect solar to charge their batteries at maximum output, regardless of the state of batteries. I get this all the time, like, my solar, I'm looking at my battery monitor, I'm not charging. Why am I not putting out, I've got a huge array. Why am I not seeing 10 amps, 15 amps as I sometimes do? I'm like, are your batteries full? Yeah. I'm like, and I tell people, I'm like, well, you know what? Actually, the battery's a little bit like like at one point, there's such a thing as an appetite. You can't force feed a battery a charge. And for you to see what the maximum output of your controller is, the only way to do that is to have the batteries in a literally depleted state, some sort of discharge. And I'm not talking going from 100 to 99. I'm talking from, you probably want to be somewhere where you're going to see at least where potentially bulk, maybe 70%, know that the batteries are low enough that solar can't do everything. You want to, and then the controllers are going to do everything they can. And then they're going to be assuming again that it's relatively sunny, that it's best part of the day, that you don't have shading. That's when you're going to be able to look at the diagnostics on those LEDs, and you're going to be able to see, okay, yeah, now I'm seeing what I thought I should see or what I saw another day, because it's going to change every day depending if your batteries are full or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the analogy that I use the most is the reservoir analogy. So I equate a battery to a water reservoir.
Okay.
And if the water reservoir is low, then the charge sources can put the full amount of current or flow into that reservoir. And it could be your alternator, it could be your shore power charger, it could be your solar. They're all pumping water back into the reservoir. But when the reservoir gets full, that stream is going to slow down to a trickle because you can't force it in there once it's full. And sometimes that helps people because they get confused about what, I mean, and myself included, when I first started working with Bruce, I kept thinking that these charge sources were sending voltage. They were sending 14 volts, but they're not. It's the batteries at 12 and it's trying to get to 14.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that, since it took me a while to figure that out, I often explain that to customers because they often have the same misconception. It's like,
it's hard.
Electrical, you're sending current to raise the voltage to a certain target and then hold it there. And there's often that question of, hey, is my alternator fighting with the solar?
Oh yeah.
And back and forth. And sometimes I will tell people to use a breaker as their main fuse for solar, that they can then turn it off, so that if they want to see separately what's going on, turn the solar off when your batteries are discharged, fire up the engine, see what the alternator's putting in, shut that down, turn the solar back on, see what the solar's putting in, see how they act, because they really should act completely independently until both of their voltage sensors start picking up what the battery voltage is. And then because that was the point I wanted to make, that the other great thing about the MPPT controllers is that they are mimicking what we're trying to do as modern charge controllers, is 3-stage, at least. I think Victron's up to 6 stages now, but at least 3-stage charging, right? Where you've got your bulk stage, your absorption phase, and then the float phase. It's another real advantage of having solar on your boat, is that, especially if you have lead batteries, they are never fully charged, almost ever. And so the solar can do that finishing charge for an extended period of time when, the boat's sitting out on the mooring, especially if you're not shoreside, if you're not plugged into your shore power. The typical sailor never fully charges their lead battery even if they run the alternator for, 2 hours a day. It could take 12 hours to fully finish charging that battery and keep it from sulfating. So having a nice solar system on board really helps with that finishing charge.
Totally agree.
And it's regulated. It's sending it at the proper float voltage.
It's so true. And it's, in some ways, here sometimes we have power outages, it does happen. It's not the grid failing, but windstorms,
right.
Windstorm's going to happen. Some power lines are going to go down. And so solar, even when you're connected to shore power, on my boat, I don't get to see it every day. Some boat owners get to see their boat every day. That sounds to me like paradise. But some people like me, I get to see my boat maybe sometimes, I'm missing weekend. I'll miss 2 weekends. And now it's at a dock, connected to shore power. It's got a battery charger, but it's also connected to solar panels, the batteries, via controllers. And if I lose my battery charger, the solar is going to step in and do what it can and help. And you're right, that finishing charge when you're actually cruising is the hardest thing to do, because, running an engine, to recharge your batteries at 100 amps is motivating, or 50 amps, you know, a maximum output of the charger, your bulk charging, you know, with your alternator, you're getting a lot of juice. But running an engine and only getting 5 amps out, because now your batteries are almost at the end of the absorption cycle or in float, and you're just topping off the battery trying to get that last charge. Running the engine and getting so little out of the engine is frustrating.
Very wasteful.
And that's where solar is awesome.
Yeah.
It does the finishing. You know, the alternator might do a lot of the bulk and might get you like most of the way there, but then at least solar is there in the background doing its thing, completely quiet, no vibration, no smoke, no noise, and it's doing its thing in the background. And yeah, that's right. It's going to help maintain the batteries in a higher state of charge, undoing potentially what you talked about, this concept of sulfation, which is really aging for a battery. It's not being able to re-energize the battery completely as we should. I mean, the reality is, you know, none of us are treating batteries perfectly. You can't. If you're using a battery, it's getting warm. The question is, you're trying to mitigate how much you're doing that. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I was thinking of another thing to bring up about controllers, which Victron has really pushed, and it's working really well, is the using Bluetooth within the solar controllers, and also for the temperature sensing. Because it used to be that, and still with a lot of controllers, if you want to get proper temperature compensation, which incidentally, if people don't know what that is, that it's essentially, if your battery is cold, you can hit it with more current and push it to higher voltage. If your battery is hot, you want to lower that, because you can damage the battery if you're charging it too much when it's hot. So temperature compensation is actually pretty important. Used to be that even the Victron controllers had to be in that battery compartment, sensing the temperature. And so now they have this little device. It's called the Smart Sense, and it's glued onto the side of the battery and connected to the plus and minus. And then you network it with the handy app on your smartphone to that particular controller or any number of controllers on the boat. And the controller will receive the battery temperature from that little sending unit. So that gives you a lot of flexibility about where to mount the controllers. And it also gives you this flexibility of, you know, just opening the app on your smartphone and seeing immediately, hey, what's my solar doing? Oh, cool. I'm getting, you know, this many amps or, you know, total watts. And my batteries are 60 degrees. And that's why, because I get calls from clients and they say, oh my God, you know, the solar is pushing it to 15 volts. What's going on? I'm like, well, how cold are your batteries? Yeah. Oh, they're 55 degrees. Oh, well, that's okay. I actually had a client
all the time.
Email me the other day saying, you know, is this okay? And I'm saying, yes, it is, because of temperature compensation.
I'm going to rehash that. I think it's a great point you bring, Tom. The temperature compensation is essential. I mean, even us humans eat differently in the wintertime than we do in the summer.
Right.
You know, honestly, I think batteries are so similar to people. And so you literally have an inverse correlation, right? In the wintertime, it's cold, you eat more. In the summertime, it's hot, you eat less. Batteries are the same. They actually want, you know, when batteries are cold and you've got low temp, you're right, the voltage is going to go higher. It's going to be temperature compensated, assuming, of course, that the temperature sensor is mounted in the right place and never on top of the battery. Never, ever, because there's an air pocket there. You can put it, some of the temperature sensors can go right on the lug, you know, because obviously that's, right. It's going to be like metal is a great conductor of heat or temperature. So the temperature of the lug, and generally we put them on the negative, not the positive. Right. That's going to be a good way. Or like you said, Tom, and it's really good point, you can put it on the side of the battery because there's no air pocket, you know, and you're going to get a good temperature. And then the question would be even bigger, is like, okay, well, now I got a bigger bank. Where do I put the temperature sensor on a bigger bank? And you got to figure out, you know, and I've seen battery banks fail because the temperature sensor was put at a battery that was not really representative of what happens to the rest of the bank. So that's putting a temperature sensor is not a trivial thing. It sounds trivial, but it isn't. And you're right. Inverter chargers have been doing that for a long time. I think probably, I don't even know, 20 years. I think I know Xantrax inverters back in the early 2000s had temperature compensation.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of boaters that know enough do worry when the battery voltage on a 12-volt bang goes to 15, 15.1, 15.2. Like, oh my God, what's going on? I'm like, my batteries are being cooked. I'm like, well, hang on a second. Here in the Pacific Northwest, the water temp is 9 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Celsius, 11 degrees Celsius in the wintertime. So it doesn't freeze, but it gets pretty cold. And batteries, all the numbers that we think in our mind, 14.4, 13.4, 12.8, 12.6, 12.2, all these sort of like different, that is all for batteries that are at 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's basically all those numbers. What we think is normal is normal at 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius. And as soon as the temperature differs from that, you will charge your batteries faster and not overcharge and not undercharge your batteries, because both are bad. Overcharging and undercharging are both bad. Of course, overcharging will bring a faster death, but undercharging will still be a death. It's just going to be like eating, fast food every day, every meal. Eventually, you might start, it won't feel too good after a period of time, but if you did that for a year or two, you're not going to be the same person as you started. You're just not.
So Jeff, do you think you are a lithium battery or a lead battery? What do you think? I think I'm a lead battery, but
I'm a lead battery.
Bruce is a lithium battery.
I'm a lead battery. Yeah, old school. It's okay. You know what? It's been working around for a while. I know.
It takes
no doubt
longer to cram the information into my brain.
Oh yeah, that's really good.
Nigel
really
probably
good.
like Bruce is a lithium battery. He can absorb.
Oh, that's good. I never
faster.
had that question asked to me before. Are you a lithium or lead? I'm like thinking, did I hear that right? Yeah. I was like, oh yeah. I was like, yeah, I'm a lead acid battery. That's what I am.
Anyway, here's the edition of ProBoat. It's edition 190 for those who want to read. This is where my article about how to choose your solar controller is enclosed. And I got some pretty good feedback from that, a few questions. So anybody who wants to reference that, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a real pro magazine. Like when I go to boat builders, I mean, that's the magazine the owner has on their desk, or the general manager has on their desk. The electrical manager has on their desk. Like it's really, definitely read by industry.
It helps keep me informed because I'm also selling or trying to sell more electric propulsion systems, and it's this magazine really helps keep me in touch with what's going on in the industry.
Before you go, Tom, one last question. You briefly talked about this, but I think it's important to bring it up. Do you want to again speak a little bit, because this is a common question. I mean, there is so much difference of opinions there on series versus parallel. You briefly touched about, obviously, of dedicated controllers per panel. And by the way, if you are going to experience shading on your boat, and that could be even, obviously, sailboats experience a lot of shading because of the boom and the rigging and stuff like that. But even powerboats, even if you have a bimini or even have a hard top, you might have a significant open array in the back. You might have a SAT TV dome or a SAT TV dome and a COM dome.
Yep.
So shading is a problem for many of us. Most of us boaters do not have a shade-free location for installing solar panels.
Yeah.
So anyway, now that putting that shading issue aside, you want to weigh in a little bit about series versus parallel shading and how it relates to controllers a little bit more.
Absolutely. Essentially, it can come down to mechanics of installation versus slight gains in efficiencies. So, for instance, if you put two panels in series, the voltage is going to double. So you have to check what the voltage rating of the controller is. Now, an advantage of series is that you make your connection up where the panels are, and now you only have one pair of wires to run below. Okay. So as opposed to our recommended thing where you've got one controller per panel, now, well, you've got two sets of wires that you need to get through the deck. So that's a kind of an immediate gain for going into series, because it allows you to, I've got one less deck gland, I've got, one less set of wires to run below, et cetera. So that's one basic distinction. If you decide that putting the panels in parallel to deal with shading is your choice to do that, because you still want one controller. You don't want to have two controllers. It's recommended that you put blocking diodes between the panels so they don't backfeed each other. And those blocking diodes reduce your output by, I don't know, 0.7 volts, something.
Yeah, 0.7 about. Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah.
So that's a compromise. I mean, everything on a boat is a compromise, right? But that's a compromise that lowers your output, but allows you again to have just two wires going to a single controller. But the thing to remember is when you put panels in parallel, the voltage stays the same, but the current doubles.
Yeah.
And so now you've got to size your wire and your fusing and everything according to that now doubled current. So
to the controller. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a little game that you play with. How many wires do I want running below? How efficient do I want the system to be? How much shading is there really or not? A common setup that we've recommended, let's say someone has a large bimini and the boom overhangs it a little bit, like the first third. So often but they don't want every single panel to have its own control. It's like, let's say they got 6 panels up on the bimini. So that's 12 wires to deal with. So a compromise that's been pretty successful is I'll have a port array and a starboard array. So I put the 3 panels on port in series and the 3 panels on starboard in series. And so when the boom is, on the port side and shading that a little bit, well, you'll reduce some output there, but the whole starboard array is still pumping.
That's such a good point, Tom.
And that gives you 2 controllers, 2 sets of wires to go below. And that's been like an example of a good compromise layout for people.
I agree. That being said, I tell people especially if you're a sailboater and you have limited charging sources on your boat and you're really power hungry, it does pay off to run dedicated controllers. I can tell you that, you put them labor up front. It's going to be painful. It's going to hurt. It's never easy. It's not what you want. But I can tell you that for the boaters that are really want something. And I mean, if you're not believing that solar is great for you, then it's harder to justify putting all that extra effort. But if you've been converted or you truly believe that our recommendations are good and they're tangible, then I can't emphasize enough how, yes, I did. But the same thing on my boat. I had 6 panels, 6 controllers. Yeah, it was a lot of work. Yeah, it was bigger holes. But the flip side is, the efficiency of my solar array was just absolutely breathtaking. Every time I would look at the stats, I was just blown away, but I didn't cut corners, and the problem is sometimes, go ahead, Tom.
I'm sorry. It also speaks to the age-old maxim of all sailors, which is redundancy, right? So if you've got one controller that craps out and all of your panels are going through that controller, unless you have another one in a bag in the builds, you're done. But if you've got multiple controllers for multiple panels, at least,
you don't have lose everything.
Other ones.
Yeah, and I want to also, for the listeners, that what Tom brought about is really good. Like we do the same thing. This concept of port and starboard, let's say, for example, but this, maybe having 2 panels on port on one controller, 2 panels on starboard on controller, assuming, again, on a sailboat that the shading would be generally either affecting all panels on starboard, all panels on port. And so if they're going to be experiencing similar type of shading, then it makes sense. You don't have to worry about having individual controllers on the starboard side. When one panel is shaded, the other is also shaded, then it might make sense. And you're absolutely right. We do this a lot on biminis. We'll say, okay, we'll put these 2 panels on port, these 2 panels on starboard, because whenever one really experiences a lot of shading, the other will as well. And that's a way to reduce cable sizes. And also the challenges on some boats, although the controllers are tiny, as you were showing. I mean, the Victron controllers are the size almost of a pack of cigarettes. Not the small one, but the bigger one that I saw my father smoking when I was growing up. And, but sometimes on the boats, where are you going to mount that? Where are you going to mount that even near the battery? It's easy to plan in our heads when we don't have to deal with a boat. But when as a boat owner, you're like, okay, sure. But where am I going to put that? Like not all of us have a closet or a bulkhead waiting to have controllers mounted, right? So it is a challenge. And so
especially if you get into those those larger Victron controllers, like the 150.
Mm,
And now we're talking cigar box mini
yeah,
briefcase. That thing it's being,
huge.
where are you going to put it?
Yeah, huge heat sink on it as well. Yeah, that's
Uh,
awesome, Tom. Anything else you want to add that we haven't spoken about on controllers that you want to share with the
no,
listeners?
I think I'm good for now. I did want to point out that in the article, there's a little side panel about shading and tests that we did, which demonstrated, the difference between having independent controllers and a single controller, and it's pretty conclusive. That's a good thing to refer to if you
That's awesome.
aren't.
Is it able? Are readers able to find that article online, or do they have to get the physical copy?
I believe that since it's now a couple of months old, that they should be able to find it. But if anybody has trouble and wants to read it, I can send it to them now. Aaron
cool.
Porter gave me permission. Now I can send it out. So you can always reach me at tom@oceanplanetenergy.com.
Thank you, Tom.
Jeff, it's really great to meet you virtually.
That's awesome.
I did want to ask you, is there any chance you were going to the Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festival in September?
Oh my God, don't, I'm going to start crying. I was supposed to go that, by the way, I've heard so many great things of that festival. I tried the year prior to COVID. The hotel rooms are so booked there. It's like you're trying to go to Mecca or something on a pilgrimage. It's like, there's no way in hell. Last year I had I was looking on Expedia every day until the hotels came online for that. Booked it, and of course because of COVID got canceled. This year I didn't know what was going to happen with COVID, so I didn't book the hotel room. So I have no plans of going, although I've heard phenomenal things about the Port Townsend Boat Show. Like phenomenal.
Well, anyway, I'm going. I found a Airbnb to stay at.
Awesome.
And I'm going to give a talk on solar there at that show. So if anybody's going to be there and is interested, I'll be there and can answer questions and so forth.
Yeah, it's not a big show like obviously like Miami or Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah.
But here in the Pacific Northwest, I've heard such great things. Great things about that show.
If you make it down, send me a text and it'd be great to meet you in person.
That's awesome, Tom. Thank you for joining us and talking about controllers.
Thank you. My pleasure. Here's Nigel.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's actually my favorite boat show in the whole world.
Wow, that says a lot. You see, there you go. Yeah. I mean, there you go. That's called alignment right there. Yeah.
It's not really a boat show. It's a festival.
That's awesome.
I mean, half of the boats that are there are not for sale. The owners just want to show them off. And they're all different. It's not like a bunch of fiberglass boats that all look the same. Every boat's got its own personality, and the owners have their own personality. And there's music, and it's just a wonderful place to be.
And is it called the Wooden Boat Show?
The Wooden Boat Festival.
Yeah. I've seen one of the boats that was there in Marina in Vancouver, not Vancouver, in the Gulf Islands, just north of the San Juans. And that owner was a Boeing engineer. And the amount of love and dedication that he did to restore his, I think it was a 1930s or 1940s boat. It was, honestly, there must have been 20 people. And this was not even a boat show. This was just a guy boating with his partner, his wife, and every single person that walked on the dock. It didn't matter if their boat was $1 million, if it was $5 million boat, $100,000 boat, $20,000 boat. Every single boat owner in that marina came by and saw that boat and was like, "Oh my God!" Because you can't buy a boat like that. You just can't. You got to earn it. You got to put the effort in.
Yeah.
But that was great, by the way. Tom did awesome. That's perfect. It's good that especially on the internet, you see a lot of experts disagreeing. But when you have experts agreeing and coming to their own conclusions independently and then agreeing, you're like, okay, good, we're on the right track here. That's when you're like, okay, that one is probably solved and we can worry about other things. Why are we disagreeing on other things? What are the things we don't understand? So that's really good news. Okay, everyone. So we're going to dive into solar. For all of you out there, I want to reemphasize how solar is a real tangible way for us to recharge our battery banks from the sun. It's not only is it a good, maybe environmental decision for some of us, certainly, but besides just the environmental reasons of doing that and not having to run a generator or recharge your batteries, both power boaters and sailboaters. And here in the Pacific Northwest, having done thousands of solar arrays, I'd say it's about 50-50 sailboats and power boats. So this applies to all of us. And I'm talking 20-foot boats. I've done a solar array. Largest solar array we've probably done was on a 70-foot boat. 50-foot boats all the time. Power boats, 55, 60 feet, 30 feet, 28 feet. It doesn't matter. There is a benefit to solar to pretty much every power boater or sailboater that doesn't have a generator running 24/7. Some power boaters eventually have to run their generator forever.
Well,
power requirements are too high.
even those running generators, there's a big benefit to solar.
Oh, there is. And certainly for all of us, solar is something we have, many of us as voters have let's just say an area that is basically unused, that is just facing the sun. It could be your Bimini, could be a Dodger, it could be a hard Bimini, it could be a hard top on a powerboat. It could even be a portion of the deck that you really don't go that often, a brow. We've done it on brows. And so there's a lot of different ways of getting solars on your boat. We'll talk about rigid, we'll talk about flexible, we'll get into all of that. But first, let's find the justification for doing solar. And so with that, Nigel, I'm going to give it to you because I've seen your presentation on that, by the way. And I have to say, I love it. You really did the analysis. And so give it to us. Tell us about why should boaters consider solar on their boats?
Well, I got, 12, 15 years ago now, a large grant from the European Union with a couple of other guys to look at the energy efficiency on boats. So we collected a lot of real data and on how much it actually costs to generate electricity on boats when we're running an engine, battery charging an anchor, or running a generator to power a battery charger. And I have just gigabytes of data. And the first time I processed all of this and I looked at the numbers and I came up with a cost per kilowatt hour of generating energy on the boat, I thought I had the decimal place in the wrong place. So I did it again and came up with the same number, and I did it again and came up with the same number. And finally I realized the decimal place was in the right place.
Wow.
It's almost impossible to generate electricity on a boat using a fossil fueled engine at less than $2 or $3 a kilowatt hour. And, we're paying 10 to 20 cents at home per kilowatt hour. And in fact, most people, when they're generating electricity on a boat, it's costing them between $5 and $10 a kilowatt hour. And when we're at the end of a charge cycle, when we're charging our lead acid batteries, battery charging at anchor, we're spending about $20 a kilowatt hour for that last little bit of energy we're putting in the batteries. I mean, these numbers are pretty shocking. As I say, the first time I did it,
they're shocking.
I thought I had the decimal place point in the wrong place. And I've done these calculations dozens of times and different test data and so on, and it always comes out the same. Wow. And the core cost here, which we don't think about, is actually the amortization cost of the engine, because most of our propulsion engines, for example, they're rated for 5,000 hours in a boat. Well, you spend $20,000 putting that engine in the boat, and it's got 5,000 hours of life in it. It costs you $4 an hour to run it, regardless of whether it's doing any useful work. So then when you're at the tail end of the battery charge cycle, when you're putting a few amps into the batteries to stop them from sulfating, you're putting out maybe a few hundred watts. It's still costing you $4 an hour, plus the fuel, plus the maintenance.
Yeah.
When you factor that in, you discover that your kilowatt hour cost is going up to $10 and $15 and $20 a kilowatt hour. So when you put solar in that light and you look at like 100-watt solar panel, it's going to put out about 300 watt hours a day so that's a third of a kilowatt hour. You multiply that by 300 days in the year, and then you think about you'd be spending $10 a kilowatt hour to generate that electricity using an engine. All of a sudden, the solar looks to be a really good investment.
Yeah.
So for any boat that gets used a fair bit, obviously, if you only use the boat for 2 weekends a year, and you put $2,000 worth of solar on it, you're never, ever going to get any kind of payback out of it.
No.
But if you use your boat for a month or two of the year, or even live aboard, and then you compare the cost of the solar to the cost of generating that electricity by running an engine, a generator or the main engine, then the solar starts to look really good. And on top of that, of course, you've got less engine run time. You don't have to put up with the noise and the exhaust. You typically speaking, you keep your batteries in a higher average state of charge, which substantially extends the battery life. So that's another hidden benefit from the solar.
Yeah.
It all pencils out in a way to where I recommend nowadays anybody that's going to take their boat offshore for even a week or two a year, put as much solar on the boat as they can find space for.
100% agree. 100% agree. And you bring a good point. I mean, not only is it obviously less expensive than running a generator to recharge your batteries, but the other thing too is there's a certain, I mean, also the great thing with solar is all the costs are upfront. You know, there's no maintenance cost on a solar array. You know, when I did my solar array, it's 9 years now. You know, 9 years ago, all the costs were upfront, and they're substantial if you're doing a big array and if you're choosing, you know, better quality panels and you're doing it the right way and you're not cutting corners, and it can add up. It can certainly add up. But the flip side is it's all front loaded. You know, that those costs are gone. Once you've done all that, then every day that you're out there, and then you get not only the lower cost of energy production, but the other thing too, you're right, is to me, it's also even redundancy. You know, it's an alternative way. Like I mean, people do lose alternators, not literally losing an alternator, but the alternators have a tough life. It's really hard being an alternator. It's probably one of the hardest things to be on a boat. You know, working in a warm environment, super hot. They're asked to do these crazy things, running at maximum output for long periods of time to recharge our battery banks, and eventually they do fail. And the good news with solar is now you've got a redundant way of recharging your batteries. It might not be everything you want, but it's at least not zero. That's another thing too I like about solar. It gives redundancy, and even redundancy when you're at shore power. You know, you might lose shore power for a couple of days, 2-3 days. Now your solar array can, you know, pick up the slack. Here in British Columbia, I don't know what it's like you guys out on the eastern seaboard, but here when you go to a marina and you're staying for overnight, they're going to actually ask you if you're taking power from the dock, they're going to charge you more. You know, some slips include power, but some slips it's optional, and you'll pay an extra $5 or $10 for power that night. You know, in the summer, I have to say one of the greatest pleasures I have is when I'm cruising from May to September, and they ask me that question: "Would you like power with your slip overnight?" I'm like, "No, all good. I don't even take out the cord. You know, I don't need to. Solar just literally is taking care of all my needs in the summer because the sun's shining enough. And I'm not counting how much money I'm saving every time I go to the dock, but I certainly don't need to plug in. I just don't. I mean, I'll plug in sometimes if I need to, but sometimes if I'm there just for a night or two, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'm in the full state of charging my batteries, and solar can do that. So that's another benefit of having a solar array.
But every time you don't plug in, you're eliminating the risk of galvanic corrosion on the shore power cord. So we actually, even though, you know, we have a galvanic isolator and all that stuff, I still plug in as little as I can. And I'll plug in to rapidly charge the batteries, and then I'll unplug again.
Yeah.
I never leave our boat plugged in to shore power on an extended basis.
Yeah, because sometimes it's not your boat; it's the neighbor's boat.
Yeah,
you know, that happens a lot. We get called. You know, sometimes it's a whole section on a dock. There may be 3, 4, 5 boats, and the owner. It's not a bad owner. Sometimes it's just an owner that it's an accident. They didn't know something. You know, something happened that's unintentional. It's not always the derelicts. You know, some boats, of course, unfortunately, are abandoned or near abandoned, and those boats are some of them obviously questionable, and you know the electrical is maybe something to be worried, but sometimes it's a boat that you wouldn't even think, you know, you're thinking, oh, that boat won't give me grief. But errors do happen on boats, and you're right. So let's dive in. So obviously it sounds that there's a lot of alignment in the industry, and now especially, you know, there's enough of us have heard great stories about solar from our friends and fellow boaters who've installed. So it's not an early adopter anymore. Definitely not. So let's talk about one of the dilemmas that some, especially sailors, I mean, this is not something in the power boats, but for the sailboaters out there that are listening, question is, wind, solar, both? You want to weigh in on that a little bit, Nigel, on your thoughts about maybe even prioritization? How do you go about choosing? You're going to choose one, or should you do both? What's your thought on doing solar versus wind, or doing both, and what order?
Well, we've always had a wind generator, and there are times when it's really been useful. Mostly, I'd say when we spent quite a few years cruising in the Caribbean, and there's a lot of anchorages there where you're behind a reef, so there's no landmass in front of you, and it's calm, and you've got a 15-knot trade wind coming up over the top of the reef. And in those conditions, the wind generator will really pump out some energy. But the vast majority of the time, we're all anchored in some protected anchorages, and there's not a whole lot of wind. By definition, that's the whole point of the anchorage, is to provide protection. And the wind generator is not doing much. And so I think I mentioned this in our last discussion. In 3 summers on the west coast of Scotland, where we had an average of a gale a week, our 340 watts of solar outperformed our wind generator 2 to 1, in spite of the fact the sun almost never shone, and we had all of this wind. But most of the time we were hiding from gales in protected anchorages, so the wind generator wasn't doing that much. And even though there wasn't much sun, that you're at 60 degrees north there in the summertime, you've got 18 hours of daylight. So the solar was still outperforming the wind generator 2 to 1.
Same challenge here in the Pacific Northwest, with these giant, sort of out of the world trees that are 200, 300 feet tall surrounding our anchorages. And I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but the trees here are just absolutely.
Oh, I've seen them.
They're just out of this world. I mean, these are trees that nobody's even talking about. Back east, it would be, almost everybody would just come to see the single tree on the eastern seaboard. There's this, I mean, the anchorages here in the Pacific Northwest are absolutely bomb-proof, the majority of them. And you're right. The problem is it could be even blowing 30 outside, 35, and the anchorage might just see gusts of 10, maybe sometimes 15. But most of the time, in a lot of the anchorages, they're just so tight that you're just not getting that wind coming in, right? And that's exactly what you said. The anchorages, you're going there to be protected, to not have a big chop in the bay or in the cove or wherever it is. And so it depends where you're going, I think, with wind. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we recommend solar first. And then, again, if you're going offshore, of course, if you're sailing, makes sense. It's certainly something to consider. But I don't think wind, given a generic boat, probably start with solar and then supplement with wind if it makes sense, depending on where you go cruising and if you're going offshore.
And even if you've got a decent breeze in the anchorage, if there's any boat motion at all, it really knocks the heck out of the average output of a wind generator, because all of those output numbers are collected in a wind tunnel, or actually, if it's a low budget outfit, they'll put the wind generator on the back of a pickup truck and drive it down the road at 40 miles an hour. But either way, it's a steady state wind.
Yeah.
The minute you put that same wind generator on the boat and the boat's doing any rocking and rolling whatsoever, it cripples the output of the wind generator. So,
all right.
So you never get out of them, even if the wind is blowing, steady 15 knots. You're still not going to get 15 knots wind output out of that wind generator. It's going to be substantially below that because of any motion that's going on with the boat.
And some wind generators are unfortunately quite loud. And
so much now. I mean, it used to be the first what was it originally, the Air Marine wind generator we had, where they designed the blades to flutter at 25 knots to stall them out. And the first time that happened, we had a squall coming through. We were at the Dry Tortugas at the end of the Florida Keys, and this squall came through, and all of a sudden the wind generator went into this flutter mode, and we'd never heard it before, and it was like a howling banshee. And we thought something was tearing apart on the boat. We're running, what the hell is that? It was just unbelievable noise those things made. Well, they don't do that anymore. They got a lot of customer feedback on that issue. So they've solved a lot of those noise issues. But the other thing you get if they're not well mounted, is quite a bit of vibration down through the deck. That can be more annoying than the noise from the blades, because that can propagate right the way through the boat.
Yeah, the harmonics.
Yeah,
I could see that. And that has to be the beauty of solar, right? The beauty of solar is it's there in the background. You don't feel it, you don't sense it. It's completely doing its thing without vibration, without smoke, without noise. It's not bothering your neighbors, especially if you're in a cove with a lot of sailors that are, trying to escape the noise. They're going there for peace and quiet. Solar doesn't bother anyone, doesn't bother anybody on the boat, doesn't bother anybody around. And that, I think, is, I have boat owners actually, where one of the boat owners is saying, you know what, I don't like running my generator as much. I don't like bothering other boaters. Sure, I've got a big gen, and some boaters have a 20 kilowatt, 8 kilowatt, 12 kilowatt, and like, help me reduce my generator runtime so that when I'm in an anchorage, I can recharge my batteries as much as possible without having to run the generator, so that I don't get those side glances from the boaters around me that are thinking that we're disturbing the peace. And so solar is, there's not a lot of pain other than upfront costs with solar. It's everything is upfront. It's a little harder than, most people, they never say, oh my God, it's a lot cheaper than I thought. It's always, okay, it's more than I thought, but the benefits are just out there. They're just amazing.